Okay, so one good turn deserves another. So my second time recording this because I didn't have my mic on after I recorded the last one. Fun times. But, well, I'll just make this video that much better. What I wanted to show you is a couple tricks that I'm going to use in the next video, and I wanted to highlight some of those tools so that when I'm referencing them later in the more sped up video, that's a whole process because it's about an hour of me modeling, and I want to show you, have you wait through a whole hour of modeling just to show you 5 or 6 techniques. So I'm going to show you those here and how I use them. So let's talk first about how I do corners. And I work with some things, a little duplicates, which is also known as instancing in a lot of projects. So RX90 to give me a rotation. GZ1, that is too much Z. I moved up, hit 12 by accident to move it up here, and then control period. And I can turn on my snapping. I want to turn on for right now. Let's do vert snapping and set it to median. So I can hit G, middle mouse drag it down, and hold control to get it to snap to that point on the Z-axis. Control period back to turn this off, and control R, right click to give me my edge right in the middle, and 3, delete faces, and mirror, just like what I've been showing you how to do. Because this is gonna give me my whole panel that brings everything together. And of course I could take this and add an array to it, and that's a lot of array. What's cool about, of course, all of this is because I have an array. If I take something like this edge, control B to stretch it out, and let's do another, say control B here to give me these faces, and I G and push it backwards. It gives me, you know, a nice little wall. Maybe it's the initial part of a sci-fi panel or something like that. A lot of science fiction walls and science fiction hallways look like this, where they're sort of here and maybe have a bunch of wires or stuff running around it. So let's start with this as our initial lock-in concept. Now, when I want to build a corner, of course, I can try to take this and fuse the parts together, but I can use the mirroring tool to my advantage. So another thing I can do is if I hit Shift D, I have a duplicate of this, and if I change or edit stuff, it doesn't change this version. But if instead I use Alt plus D, what I'm creating is what's called a linked version. And what's cool about a linked version is anything I do to this happens to this too. This is really great for elements we know are repeating. So let's say I create like a little ornament or something and I know I want to use it in the same place. If I keep hitting Alt D for it, then I can just change the one thing and it changes everywhere else. This means I can throw in a really simple object, put it wherever I want my scene, and then I only have to change one and it updates all of the rest of them in my scene. So what I can do with this though, is I can use this to help build my corners, because as it turns out, modifiers don't count for linking, just the geometry data. So I'm going to set this Z back down to 0. I'm going to get rid of this array, but I'm going to leave the mirror on, and I'm going to just snap it into place. I'm going to turn on increment snap and go on absolute grid snap. This is going to snap it to the grids on our surface. Put it right about here. Now right now I have mirror, and that mirror is giving me this half of the wall. But I can do something more with that because I can, as you recall, mirror around another object, which will mirror here, but I can also mirror around any object. And one of the objects we like to use is what's called an empty. So all of these are different empties. They're all the same thing. They just look different. It's how you set them visually. I'm just going to use a plain axes, and I'm going to G, middle mouse drag left to right, and hold control to snap it to this point. An empty doesn't have any geometry. I can't edit it. It just has a position. An empty is also called a locator in Maya. If you're using things like Unity, you might use an empty object or like an empty game object. It's basically the same thing. It's something that has a scale and a rotation and a location and nothing else. And it's a really good utility thing for modeling. So in this case, I can use it to determine my mirror point. So if I select this little eyedropper and I move this around, we can see it's going to mirror around wherever this is. But I can also rotate it, and look what happens when I do. It'll actually rotate this little corner piece. So if I set this to -45, that's rotating it enough to give me a 90-degree angle. I can get this corner wrapping around, but I still got leftover geometry. However, if I turn on bisect, it'll clip anything that goes across this. So that gives me a nice tight little corner. And because they're all instanced together, if I do want to change something about the way this is modeled, so let's kind of bring this down. maybe I want to create another little element in here, say 3, and pull that back. All on the same axis, because I don't want to run it any other way. We see it goes around the corner. Now, the only limit to this is if I try to like bring something out too far. So you see I'm bringing it beyond this point. Well, it doesn't quite fit or clip in. There's a trick I can use for that though. And before this mirror, I'm actually going to add another mirror. So I can add a mirror and then another mirror. And what it does basically is before it wraps this one, it extends it by doubling its mirror length. And then it clips out the mirror. And that like just gives me enough corner to work with. So I can actually, you know, kind of go nuts with a lot of the shapes that I want in here. If I wanted to really get some cool, say like something like so. Create like a bulkhead or something, again, for like a sci-fi scene. Could be a really cool element for me to bring in. If you look, however, at the wireframe, I do have a little bit of extra geometry here, which I could always clean up by hand, but I can use another modifier in between them called decimate. And the cool thing about the decimate is it's going to get rid of, with planar, anything relatively flat. And so let's put it after both of them. It can just kind of clean things up for me. Still got this corner here. That's not a big deal. I can always clean up by hand. I'll probably leave this off though, because it's pretty easy to manually clean those up. I can do the same thing though. It doesn't have to be an outside face. If I just switch the direction and say it's 45 degrees this way, it can be an inside corner for a scene. And so this is a really easy way to say, I keep everything together. I have inside corners, I have outside corners, and it doesn't have to be 45 degrees. It could be, you know, R or Z, it could be any angle that I want. So this is really nice for modeling modular pieces and modular kits together and keeping it in this stage. Now, when I'm ready to start actually using this as part of my snapped together kit, I want to apply both of these mirrors. But right now you see it says failed. This is because they're still instanced together, and what I need to do is called make them local. Now, a thing I like a lot is this space bar, which lets me search things out. And I'll show you if you don't have it set up already. You go to preferences, and under key map, we want to make sure your key map is set to spacebar action search, not play. This way, if I hit space, I can search any tool in this and just type it in. And so single user is what I'm looking for. I want to make this object single user. And I say all these things. So now I'm going to do the same thing here, make this object single user. Now if I make a change to it, we can see it happens to this object, but it's not updating here. Again, I want to do this when I'm sure that I like how everything's looking. Because now that I've done that, I can apply this mirror, and I can apply all of these modifiers, and now it's a solid piece of geometry that I can move and edit without having to worry about this thing getting in the way or doing anything else. So when I'm ready to texture or unwrap it or do all those things, I want to apply those modifiers, but if they're all instanced, which I leave in the construction mode, I need to make them single user to the next step. So it's a couple things in here that I want to show you. There's one more thing I want to show you, which is the power of curves for doing some ornaments. I'm going to create a little curve. So Shift A, and instead of everything from the mesh menu, which is what we've been using so far, I can use instead the curve menu. And let's start with just this curve path. It's probably the simplest of the curves, and what it gives us, if we go into edit mode, is just these 5 points. And you can see as I pull them around, it creates different shapes. This is amazing because I can edit these even well, like I can come back in, I can come back out, and we see it creates a nice smooth curved shape. What's cool about this is if I bring in, say, a mesh plane, you see the mesh plane has these properties for object data, and in this case, the symbol is the mesh symbol, which is a triangle with 3 verts, because it's the smallest number of faces you can have. This doesn't have those options. Instead, it has curve options. And so curves have their own set of options in here, including some resolution options. The really cool ones, though, are down here in geometry. Under bevel, there's this depth setting. And you can see what it does is it turns it into a tube. I can fill the caps if I want. I can choose the resolution of this tube, like how much detail it has in it. And I can choose the resolution running along the tube, both of which are really, really handy. Something that's still cool about this is if I go into edit mode, it doesn't have all the points of geometry, it just has these original pieces, making this a really great way of making like tubes and wires for things. The problem, of course, is it's not actual geometry. I'll show you in a second. We can't unwrap and texture this as it is. it won't work because it's not geometry, it's actually a NURBS curve with some basically properties applied to it. But something that's really cool about this too is I can go into, instead of round, I can set it to profile. And you can see immediately profile sort of squared off the edges because it's taking this and saying, how do I get from this point to this point? Straight line. If I grab and curve this out, you can see it's now going curved line. This is really cool because if I trait some kind of crazy shapes, I can create any kind of pattern in here. And I can grab these handles and set them just like I would in like a modeling program or something like Illustrator. And I can up the resolution to make it like finer, give it a little bit more detail in here. And I have a lot more options than just this. So if I take one of these curves here, I can use tilt, which twists it. Control T does the same thing. So I can actually get it to Control T and like twist my curve around if there was some reason I needed that. So I could say, take this curve and just twist the heck out of it and create like some really crazy patterns with it. It's a little too much. I'm gonna leave all these, set them back to 0. Another thing I can do is set the radius. So I can make it wide or really small. So set it down to 0, set this one up as a wider radius. And now I have, you're starting to see where I'm going with this. Like, this is a real flourishy element piece. So let's take that into application. I'm gonna add in a new curve and a new, well, let's do something interesting here. I'm gonna go curve, and up at the top here, I'm gonna say NURB circle. Simple NURB circle, nothing really going on with it. Let's scale it down. Let's add geometry profile. I'm gonna go into presets, and I'm just gonna use this cornice molding, give it a little thickness. So that gives me like a little round little bit here. Scale it down, and maybe I want a couple like flourishy elements coming off the corners. All right, so let's take a curve. Let's bring in a path, and I'm gonna go to Z. I'm gonna tab in, and let's build out this path. I think I got maybe, let's do something like this. So when I get it here, profile, let's set its thickness up. Again, I'm just using cornice molding because it's giving me some cool extra details in geometry. Scale down its size a little bit, and let's set the radius at this end to make this like my kind of piece here. So now I can take this, and its pivot's still at the center, or I could set it to this plane. And I want to do all my detail from this orthographic so it doesn't move up and down by accident, but I can use mirrors here. So I can say mirror that direction and in that direction. And now I can take, say, this object, and I'm just going to duplicate it. And let's rotate it, say, like this way. Put it back here. L to link select. Set this back. And I'm creating something that you would say like, wow, that's really complicated details. But as we can see, I still have a lot of control over it. And it's actually relatively simple stuff. Let's add some more edges to this too. So I can take this and just Shift D, duplicate it, scale it down a little bit. And I can play with, let's reset its scale, Control A, and I can reset the scale to be whatever I want, and like bring up this element. And so I've got this all here, but fortunately I can't unwrap it or do a lot with it. And another problem I have is all the geometry is going through it. I only want the top bits. It's actually not that hard to change. Up in my settings here, I can swap it from full to half. And we can see we only get half of it, but it's not the half we want. But of course, as you recall, all we got to do is change up the tilt of the whole object together. So it's going to be, in this case, 90 degrees for the whole thing. And now I don't have a bottom to it. I can do the same thing with this, but I want to show you if I want to unwrap this or texture this later. Right now, this object doesn't have any UVs because there's no geometry. However, if I take this object, I'm going to duplicate it just so you can see it by itself. Go back to that space, and this time I'm going to say convert. I'm going to convert it to a mesh. Now that I've converted it to a mesh, I see I have mesh options. I don't have any of those other settings. It's baked in my mirroring. And now I just have everywhere else is just geometry. What that also means, because of all that, I can and I can unwrap project from view bounds. And it's gonna give me my unwrap that I can now use for my whole mesh and my model, and I can add details and stuff like that. So if you have little flourishes or little cool curly Q details, this is actually a really fun and easy way to do it. And especially in the modeling stage, because just like with the modifiers, I don't apply it until I'm ready to start texturing. Try to keep things as in the modifiers as I possibly can until I absolutely have to get rid of them. So a couple cool tips and some of the stuff I'm gonna use in the next video. Oh, one more thing I wanted to show was something I use in the video a bit is grid fill. And so grid fill is just a thing that I use sometimes where if I take, let's take this plane, I'm going to just subdivide it a bunch of times. And if I have, for some reason, spaces, L. So if I have a big empty space in the middle here, it takes a long time for me to say, select all of this and then F to fill it in and then try to go collect this point to this point, J, this point to this point, J, this point to this point, J, to like kind of connect it all up like I'd want to. A really fast way to using this is called grid fill. So I alt click on this whole thing, space, grid fill. And it literally just fills it in as a grid. I use this in a couple spots, say when I have a lot on the left and right side. So let me take all of these, get rid of these edges. You see it won't work as well if I don't have an even number of edges, grid fill, because it's confused about spans, because I want to have an even number on the left and right side. However, if I have something like this, SX, let's really stretch that in. And I'm trying to connect these parts up together. Grid fill works great because it'll just stretch that out for us. Versus if I do the same thing and I hit F, it doesn't give me those lines across, doesn't turn into quads. So grid fill is another thing I use in there. So those are the tools that I use in the next video, along with some of the vert snapping and origin moving that I've already shown you how to use. And I'm just gonna do a walkthrough of it so that I'll narrate my process and you can get a sense of how I build out all the parts of my building. I'll see you in the next one.